Can we avoid a recession and get inflation under control?
It's theoretically possible, but history is not very kind. Jerome Powell cited 3 episodes where the Fed tightened and we had a soft landing: 1965, 1984, and 1994-95. The problem is none of those episodes are really relevant to the current situation, because in all those episodes, the Fed tightened, but not enough to slow down, keep the unemployment rate from declining. In all 3 of those cases, the unemployment rate kept falling, and we can't afford to let the unemployment rate continue to fall in the current environment, because all that would do is push inflation even higher. So the chances of generating a soft landing, it seems very remote. Because the economy, if you start to push up the unemployment rate, it's very hard to control that process. There's a rule called the SOM rule, which basically says every time the unemployment rate goes up by more than 0.5 percentage point, the next stop is a full-blown recession. And a full-blown recession is not a rise of 0.5% or 1% in the unemployment rate. The smallest rise in the unemployment rate we've seen in the post-World War II period is over 2 percentage points. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the Fed to pull this off. So obviously, they should try to pull it off, but it's going to be very difficult for them to pull it off.
Bill, you said it's theoretically possible. It's going to be hard, given history, given what we've seen with past track record. Is it within the power of the Fed? Can they be smarter, or is this mainly a matter of luck, having certain other factors trigger, for example, a big infusion of labor into the workforce?
Well, I think the problem is that they waited too long to begin the tightening process. So they're just beginning to start to tighten at a time that inflation's way above their target and the unemployment rate is low at 3.8%. And Powell has characterized the labor market as extremely tight. In that situation, if you're going to try to get inflation under control, you're going to have to push up the unemployment rate. And if you push up the unemployment rate, it's almost impossible to avoid a recession at that point. So they'll try to stretch this out as long as they can. They'll try to push down inflation without pushing up the unemployment rate very much. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to be very difficult for them to pull this off. History is not kind in this situation.
Bill, as you just said, in your opinion, and a lot of other people as well, the Fed just waited too long. I wonder how much of that was because of that famous framework that was unveiled at Jackson Hole. In your piece, actually, you talk about that, and you say, quote, the Fed's application of its framework, and they have to roll it here, I'll read it from here, of its framework has left it behind the curve in controlling inflation. This, in turn, has made a hard landing virtually inevitable. Does Jay Powell need to admit that the framework was a mistake before they can make progress here? Because you've seen him being asked this question several times, and every time he refuses to admit the framework was a mistake.
Well, I don't think the framework was a mistake in the sense that they changed their inflation objective to 2% inflation to 2% inflation on average. The problem is how they operationalize that. If you recall, what the Fed basically said is we're not going to raise short-term interest rates until we see 2% inflation. We're confident that inflation is going to be above 2% for some time in the future, and we've also reached full employment. So that's the situation where we ended up in. We were basically at 0% interest rates at a time that the economy was actually calling for at least a neutral monetary policy, if not a tight monetary policy. And that's where we are today. There's a big gap between where we are and where we need to be. And that's why the whole narrative around the Fed has changed pretty dramatically in the last few months. We're no longer talking about whether the Fed's going to raise rates a couple times. We're talking about how fast the Fed is going to sprint towards neutral over the next 6 to 12 months.
So, Bill, let's jump ahead and assume we do tip into recession. What can we do to make it shorter and make it more shallow? Are there things we can do right now to try to not make it quite as painful or as long?
Well, first of all, we can hope that inflation comes down a lot just of its own accord, because as some of these transitory factors which have pushed inflation up start to reverse themselves over the next year. I don't think used car prices are going to continue to go up 40% a year, for example. So I think there is something right about the Fed's original story that a good portion of these inflation pressures were transitory. The problem is that the inflation has been high enough for long enough that it's now getting into wages. So when we have wage trends of 5% or more, that's not consistent with 2% inflation, which is precisely why the Fed has to generate more slack in the labor market. Look, I'm hoping that, best case scenario is a year from now, inflation will be running 3% as opposed to 4 or 5%. And in that case, the Fed can be relatively gentle because a 3% inflation is not a huge problem. If we're at 4 or 5% inflation, then the Federal Reserve is going to have to just keep on tightening. And at that point, chances of a hard landing go up probably to 100% at that point.
Bill, you've been a central banker. I have never come close to being a central banker, but as not a central banker, when I look at it, when I hear recession, I say, that's okay, because the Fed can loosen monetary policy, and that's going to take us out of it. Right now, I don't see exactly how they could do that. So what tools does it have, if we do go to a recession, to help the situation?
Well, if the Fed tightens monetary policy sufficient to tip the economy into recession, then the Federal Reserve will reverse course, and they'll ease monetary policy, and they'll expand the balance sheet, and they'll provide stimulus to the economy. The problem is that monetary policy is a blunt instrument, so it's very hard to manipulate the economy very precisely, and that's what the historical record tells you. It's just, the Fed's tried for soft landings before, and they've never been able to pull it off when they've actually had to push up the unemployment rate.
Monetary policy is one half of it. Fiscal policy is the other. Obviously, the Fed can't control that. At the same time, we just have a new budget outline, at least provided by the Biden administration right now, which says it focuses on deficit reduction by increasing taxes. Is that going to be helpful if, in fact, we're headed toward a recession?
Well, obviously, if you're tightening fiscal policy in the middle of a recession, that's not helpful at all. Look, I wouldn't put much weight on what the Biden administration has proposed, given the deadlock in Congress between the Democrats and Republicans. We've seen, for example, if just one Democratic senator peels off, you don't get any legislation whatsoever. So I think it's, this is something that's on paper. Whether this actually translates into something in reality, I would be pretty skeptical about at this point.
And finally, Bill, one of the things you talk about in your piece is the bond market. Yeah, you're not trading, you're not in the bond market. At the same time, you do look to it as an indicator of things that are going on. Does the bond market get it, what you've just said, the likelihood of recession?
Well, the bond market thinks it's going to go exactly that way, that the Federal Reserve is going to overdo it, and then they're going to have to reverse course beginning in the second half of 2023 and into 24. Where I think the bond market doesn't get it is how far the Fed's going to have to go to actually slow the economy down enough to actually deal with inflation. The bond market still sees a peak in short-term interest rates of only around 3%, maybe 2.75%, 3%. I still think that's somewhat low relative to what the Fed needs to do. And of course, the more optimistic the stock market and the bond market are about how little the Fed has to do, guess what? That means the Fed has to do more. So, as Powell has talked about a number of times, financial conditions matter, and the Fed needs to tighten financial conditions. Well, how do you tighten financial conditions? You push down stock prices, you push up bond yields. And to the extent that doesn't happen, then the Federal Reserve has to do more.